and that creative Dharma perhaps can be considered just as Dharma, and just a different word for it. It's just secular Dharma with a different word. It's creative rather than secular, which gives it a different dynamism. And that he's very open to other approaches, very enthusiastic about other ways of approaching this. He genuinely thought that was great, that there was other ways into this. So yeah, thinking about it, he's probably thinking creative Dharma as a term is a nicer, more easy to access term than secular Dharma, but was probably thinking the content would be similar to secular Dharma. And now is perhaps thinking it could be more than that. It could be a different approach to the Dharma. But I'm now guessing. I'm trying to get inside his head as to, yeah. But I do remember that, and I'm being quite surprised that he didn't think of creative Dharma the same way I'd been thinking about it.
Mm. That's hey, it just shows. So at the moment, the newsletter would be the kind of tool in creative Dharma as he sees it, but he actually thinks that it might spread out into other ways of communication or whatever. Do I get this right?
I think.
Or is the newsletter the main thing that creative Dharma does?
I don't know. My guess is that the newsletter is the central element of a network, and the network develops, puts different people in contact with each other around the world. And from that, a number of activities could spur off. That would be my way of assuming. So for instance, from my perspective, at the moment, I'm doing a weekly drawing meditation Zoom, and it's from people who are in Ashburton, near where Chrissy lives, because she said, why don't you do this? And I was supposed to do it as a live thing, and I couldn't do that. So it's become a small group of people who are interested in doing drawing meditation. There's no reason why that couldn't be worldwide, since it's Zoom. There's no reason why that couldn't be a creative Dharma activity promoted by the newsletter, which was a weekly worldwide thing. So in that way, the newsletter would become the conduit for networking. That's just one example, but there could be lots of other ways to do it. I'm not sure that that's actually something I want to do, but just for instance, that's something that could happen. So you could have like-minded people around the world, or equally you could have a local group of people, which was more secular Dharma based, and there were weekly or whatever meetups for Dharma talks and meditations or whatever. It had nothing really to do with the artistic side, if you like, and they were just to do with secular Dharma.
Yeah.
You know, I think any newsletter, for example, that's just going to cover things like, you know, Dharmic activities and Dharmic projects, news, or whatever, and I can see use for that. I guess I mean, just in itself, that's useful, just keeping it simple. Having a newsletter in a news list format, I guess. where summaries of stories are posted. But I think I'd like to sort of see it a little bit, just a little bit more inclusive by, for instance, if this could, how news agencies work. News items will come in a constant stream. They'll come in from AFP or Associated Press or Agence France Presse. Is that what they call it here? So you've basically got streams of stories, and you can just pick out whatever you want and put it into your newspaper. Now, if the newsletter if the articles that were summarized or reproduced were under a Creative Commons license, that would mean anybody getting that feed could then post it on their own newsletters and their own little media distribution without sort of having to think about things like copyright. It's just basically a syndicate, a content syndicate for dharmic content. What do you think about that?
You know much more about this than me, and I would suggest that you talk to Ramsey, and it might well be that he's already thinking about these things. But yeah, you're talking about stuff that I don't know, and we didn't discuss. So, but I can't see any reason why that doesn't sound absolutely sensible. When you were talking, one thing that occurred to me is that what seems at first sight to be quite interesting about this is that it's not an association that already has a structure, or it's not a college, it's not a retreat center, so it's not Gaia House, it's not Sharpham Trust, it's not Bodhi College. Whenever I get a newsletter from them, my first thought is it's Gaia House, it's Bodhi College. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it does have an association with an existing institution. This newsletter potentially doesn't have that, and therefore immediately to me is more open. So I'm not listening to the opinions and views of a set organization which has already set up its opinions and its views. So I know what I'm going to get. Well, no, that's fine. But this has a sense of, at the moment, of being a more open structure, in that it doesn't have its own, I hesitate to use the word dogma, but it doesn't have its own
baggage.
Yeah, well, that's even worse than dogma. It doesn't have its own set of principles from which, and I agree with those principles. They're fine, but it's nice that in a way this doesn't have that. It doesn't have the word college or retreat center associated with it. So in that sense, I quite think, just thinking about it from what you were saying, if it's more of a news forum, to me that's actually more exciting, because it's more flexible and offers more opportunity for different points of view.
That's interesting, because I think exactly the opposite.
Oh.
I mean, that's just my really, I don't know. See, I thought, isn't that interesting that someone does that, calls it creative dharma, and then hasn't even thought about creativity. That's a new thought to him. I have the liberty of not knowing the guy, and I think he sounds really lovely. But it's one guy, and you say, oh, it's not a college established with their ideas. And I say, there's one idea with his ideas. And I would be, I'm just more suspicious about that than even about a college, because he calls it creative, But if you compare to what our, remember our city idea and how people can just populate it and have these different layers, and it would, and the idea, the big idea would have been that it is kind of self-organizing. You couldn't get further away from one guy offering a newsletter. That is totally, for me, that's, has the whiff, and he might be lovely, and so I'm just saying that I don't know him, and he might have the best intentions, and still it's one guy that tells you what's what in a newsletter. And that is as far away from me, from creative Dharma, as it can get as a structure. And if I compare that to what we were talking about, I'm with Gary. This might be useful. It's sweet. Creative, I don't know. Someone curating it and saying this goes in, this doesn't go in. He already told you he's very good at that. Woo! Okay. I'm just a suspicious mind. Anyway, from our the idea that I picked up from you guys was so much more knowledge about that. When we talked about the city and the map and how people could contribute and navigate it themselves and make contributions, and the idea being about it being self-organizing in a way, and also that big idea that because of what goes in there can be found by AI to inform something big. Now, all those things are just, for me, as far away from a newsletter as it gets. I don't know if that can be found in any way, if it would be relevant. It sounds pretty irrelevant for AI to me. And again, creative, I cannot find the creativity in it at the moment, but I'm just really mean-minded.
No, it's to be honest, I hadn't thought about it as being an alternative to what we were talking about doing. I just thought of it as being a newsletter, really, just something that was what he was promoting and trying to start up as a way, I think, of, as say, sort of spreading the word of secular Dharma without using secular Dharma. And that it would be something that perhaps later, when we were more assured of what our city was, or the idea was, that would be something that could appear in the newsletter. I didn't know. It didn't occur to me that this was an alternative.
Okay, maybe I did misunderstand.
Yeah, no,
okay.
No, to me it was just no, more of something which would be able to communicate the idea of what other people around the world were interested in. So in a way, it's sort of like, how do you connect people with the city? Well, and I think Gary had communicated with me that he was thinking about newsletter idea at some stage, because it is a method of communication.
Okay, well, I'm really glad that you're not seeing that as the alternative, because he's got that good title. It's a good title. Creative Dharma.
I think this is just one of many projects, which small or large, that could evolve. But I think the important thing, in order to get any sort of synergy, any sort of reach, is lateral interconnection, rather than this hierarchical sort of hub type structure. So rather than a top-down hub, having a star hub, which just basically reaches out and receives from various other hubs.
Yeah.
So I think that's the sort of a relationship that I would like to sort of see established between people who have got activities and projects related to dharmic activities or dharmic discussions. And a newsletter like that could, if it's done right, be very useful. As just especially if it was done as a Creative Commons syndication. I think that would be brilliant. But I'll need to talk to Ramsey about that. I've been meaning to talk to him. I've been meaning to reply to his emails, but there's just so many. I just got no chance of really catching up these days. So I may have to declare email bankruptcy very soon. But anyway, that's the way I feel. I think it's worth supporting and looking at and seeing what ways it can be perhaps created in an open way as possible. So that, not just in terms of input, but in terms of what can be pulled out of it. In other words, feeding other hubs. So anyway, I'll talk to Ramsey about that, see what he reckons. But I can certainly see something like that being very useful for many other different projects, like defining Dharma as one perhaps project, and there's a myriad of other activities and discussions going on, which could sort of at least filter some news through some sort of syndicated hub or hubs that can be sort of cross-shared without sort of having to worry about copyright and all this sort of nonsense. So yeah, that's what I'm feeling about it. I'm fairly positive. I'll just have to sort of see exactly what it is, or the sort of paradigm that Ramsey is really thinking about.
Yeah, because you know him, don't you? You
No.
have support. No, I thought you supported.
Oh yes, I did. Yes, I supported
project
the,
with
there's been a few things.
the workbook.
That was one of them too. So yeah, I mean, but I even forget how I came across him. I might have even just replied to one of his YouTube videos. It might have come out of that. That was years ago. I can barely remember, but I've never met him in person. I've never spoken to him. I've exchanged emails sort of every now and again over the years, but it usually breaks down because I forget to reply. So, but I really do need to have a talk, I guess.
Very interesting. But it shows that there's something in the air about the creativity bit, though, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And that's really. I'm so glad, Rupert. That's that, and Gary, your combination of you have such mutual interest in those two, where you really think afresh. Gary in the IT stuff and Rupert in the creativity, but really sharing that interest in the other. I think your relationship there is something that for me has great dynamic and novelty, and I do like that and for me it's an advantage that it isn't just from one person. Even there's just two is already good for me, because I don't think that, well, many reasons. Anyway, I think you got something more fresh from me than that. But I don't want to down talk a newsletter with the right attitude. It's always good communication tool. At the same time, maybe it's very traditional as well, and as Gary says, it's a kind of, from the structure immediately, it is a hierarchical thing. someone is the editor. Yeah.
But, the thing is, though, that, these sorts of, in open source, we call them gatekeepers. Basically, every open source project has a person or maybe a couple of persons who basically determine, what comes in, what gets changed, what doesn't get changed, what bugs get fixed, what bugs don't get fixed. It all has to come through that gatekeeper. So even though the entire content is free for absolutely anybody to use and to change and to basically take it away and start again, the concept of gatekeepers is actually quite important. And I don't think it necessarily infers, or necessarily always it has to infer, structured hierarchy. And I think the open source model is very, it's a great example of that sort of cooperative coming together of people to actually work on a project completely voluntarily and without any sort of aim of becoming famous or anything, or getting a lot of money, because that's not going to happen. But yet, yeah, you still have these hubs, but these hubs can interconnect. That there's this whole networks of open source projects which are linked together, because one part of a project might do one particular type of function, another project might sort of be specialized on other areas, and somehow they come together in another package. So there's all this layering that goes on, this interconnectedness between open source projects, which is, I think a model that could be emulated. And it doesn't get away entirely from the hub concept, but what it does is atomize to some degree hubs. So you're not just having singular hubs, you're having multiple interconnected hubs which can choose to accept or whatever sort of feeds of information and stories from or discourse from other hubs. Once again, I guess I'll have to speak to Ramsey and just see what how he's envisaging it. Because I think the organization is as important as what you do. Because if the foundations aren't, or the motivations aren't, correct from the start, it's really easy just to rush out and do a top-down hierarchical thing. Anybody can do that. But to build cooperation and community is organic work, and which is assisted by intercommunications between various and different kinds of related groups.
Yeah, I think it would be very valuable if you spoke to him and got a clearer understanding of the mechanisms. I did mention that what we were doing in our group. I didn't go into any details, but because I thought it would be useful at some stage for us to be able to use the newsletter to publicize in some form what it is that we're doing, in order to see if there are other people who are interested, and to get and in some way to be able to spread what it is. I mean, at the moment we have an idea, we don't really have a thing, and so it shouldn't be something that goes out certainly in the first newsletter, but it would perhaps be something that would give us a focus of where we're going. If we said to ourselves, well, look, we've got something here where we could let other people know, we could spread the word beyond the Bodhi College Secular Dharma group, of things that we're interested in trying to develop. And if we had a focus and we had said, we're going to put this in a newsletter, then we would have to know what the words are that we're going to go into that paragraph in a newsletter. So it might be useful for us to think of it as something which would provide us with focus for our discussions.
Mhm.
Mhm. Mm.
You know, if we said that, right, within 2 months, we're going to have to write something which could go in a newsletter, then it sort of might make us think, right, well, what is that going to be? And I think personally, I'd quite appreciate that, because I like talking about all sorts of stuff, but I also like the idea of something that channels that discussion.
Mhm.
So you mentioned that to him, and what was
Yeah,
his
no, he said
comment?
that would be fine. Not immediately, and no, not immediately, because we don't know what we'd be saying. But yes, he seemed to be very open to any ideas that would expand on whatever creative Dharma is. But how do you two feel about having sort of saying, yes, we should try and work towards some form of announcement of this is what we're doing?
Well, I think, it's getting fairly close where, perhaps a germ of a project idea that's sort of manageable. I think there's a germ of some ideas. I guess for me, part of my problem is having to be focused on keeping my ships afloat. So, my time is and attention is taken up rather a lot recently. But yeah, I mean, I don't stop thinking about these things, and I'm making notes constantly. But to actually sit down and put it all together into some sort of coherent thing, putting together, together with everything that we've discussed previously. And the videos have been very helpful for that, of reminding me of things which were discussed and which I'd forgotten or which I'd missed. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's realistic to sort of, try and put a date on it. I think 2 months is not unreasonable to get some sort of project summary. This is what we would like to do, and this is how we'd like to do it for this particular reason. I think we can have something out, hopefully within a couple of weeks. That'd be my hope.
I think it's good. A deadline focuses the mind. It doesn't it? I feel very similar to Gary. There's a lot on for me at the moment, so attention has to be divided, and still it's good to have a kind of, not a deadline, but some focus projected there, and where we can say, okay, it would be lovely to work towards that, to have a goal in mind in the way of a first project plan, a first draft of that, or something maybe to offer to the world.
Okay, well, the first newsletter is the 31st of May, so presumably that means the next one is going to be the end of June and the end of July. So if we said we were working towards one of those, probably July, but if we had something before then, for June, end of June, then there's 2 deadlines. So one's 6 weeks and one would be 10 weeks. So that's at the moment I'm the one who hasn't actually got much on, because I don't have your problems, but I am going to have problems soon, because I have to go out to Italy because Italy's opened up again. They're opening their borders, which means that the houses I've got there have got to got ready for, one of them's got to be ready for people coming, because they've let it. I thought they were all going to get cancelled, but it doesn't look like they are now. So the lettings are going to go ahead. So I'm going to have to go and sort that out. And then we're in the middle of selling the house here, and God knows how I'm going to cope with both of those things going on at the same time. But so I may well be distracted, let's say. But at the moment, it's the calm before I'm allowed to leave. Anyway, but then if I do come back, I'll probably have to be isolated for 2 weeks, which may give me plenty of time to. But I don't know where I'll be isolated. Anyway, enough of that. But I would have thought, if we say end of June, more likely end of July, then that's a sort of reasonable thing for us to provide a focus for. And like Gary, I make sort of notes quite often. Things occur to me in the middle of the night, and I want to try and get some of those things together. And I think I'll be using the forum to post things on, just so that we can be able to have a think about those. There's lots of things that occur to me, and I'd like to be able to share them. I'd like to be able to have a discussion and to think which ones of those are worth pursuing, and which ones have got validity, and which ones are off track, sort of thing.
I think end of June, end of July is a reasonable objective. I could certainly work towards that in whatever I'm doing.
Cool.
One of the things that occurred to me, and on the nature of creative Dharma, was that the Dharma itself was created. I mean, if we're talking about what Gautama did, then there was a stage where he sat down under his tree, and there was no Dharma. And then after a while, he woke up and there was a Dharma. And that in itself must mean that it was a creative act. And it's creativity in the sense of how creativity works, in that you put in lots and lots of information, and then you just can't do anything. You just have to let it stew. You have to let it incubate.
I love that.
Is the technical term, because there's nothing anybody can do to force creativity. But without putting lots and lots of stuff in the first place, you're not going to get stuff out. So it's this sort of unknown processing, and what you get at the end of it, you hope, is an outcome which resonates with the position you were in before that outcome. And we tend to often have it related to a problem. So with Einstein's problem that he had with Newtonian physics, he knew there was something wrong, but he didn't know what the solution was. And for that, you had a very particular solution, which was general special relativity. And when that came to him, as I reading about this, for about 2 weeks afterwards, he was on this extraordinary high of this extraordinary idea had emerged. It didn't come in a steady process. It came as an aha moment. It just arrived, but only because it was a problem, and 2, it was all of the information that he'd done, all of the processing that he'd done prior to that. But I don't think that creativity is always a solution to a problem, in that artistic creativity tends not to be, because it is what you come up with is, you haven't really set yourself a problem. You've set yourself a circumstance. You've immersed yourself within a particular way of thinking about things, and you're looking at a way of expressing it, a way of communicating it. But you're not thinking of it necessarily as a solution to a problem, as you would within a scientific problem. But nevertheless, the processing of that is very similar, in that you immerse yourself within the field. There's a period of incubation, and then there are outcomes, there are inspirations. And it seems to me that that happens all over the place, but we don't tend to think of it like that. We don't tend to formalize that structure. But I'm guessing that happens all of the time, in all professions and in all walks of life, to varying extents. And that, as I say, it is the center of what the Dharma, as expressed by Gautama, must have been. At one day it didn't exist, and then another day it did exist. And it existed because of the processing that went on in a person's mind. And looking at it from that point of view, it does sort of suggest that all of the activities that we immerse ourselves in when we think about this, the things that come out of it, are all part of that creative process. And because we're associating it with the Dharma, then I think creative Dharma is an interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah, I totally agree with your idea of the creative process. You have to put a lot in, and in that state of flow, which meditation can easily get, or can get you into, which is certainly something free of egoic thinking, and then one might, I always call it a flow form. I don't know if you know these things that make a figure of 8.
Yeah.
So when a flow, a steady straight flow, the stream goes into an oscillation, and that's my mental picture for that creative moment, where really something from staying in flow and not getting caught up in an eddy of egoic thinking and judgments, but staying in that flow, and then it goes into that flow form oscillation, and something unusual gets created. I don't know if it's new, because it's like a reconfiguring of everything that was ever put into it, for sure. That feels new enough for me anyway. And yeah, that is a glorious moment. And that's how your meditation, you make that a practice, actually, with the drawing meditation, to stay in that flow. And that's a beautiful thing.
I remember reading a book on meditation. I can't remember which one it was now, but I've still got the book, so I could find it out. And the guy who was teaching it was very much against doing any creativeness in your meditation, because he didn't want that. He just wanted people to meditate. But he recognized that meditation, or insight meditation, can produce insights, and it can produce creative moments, and people used it, or were using it, in order to enhance creativity. And I think that, and I think that's that's true, that meditation does aid the process of creativity. It's happened to me. So
Yeah, that's one way. But then what is meditation is always this sense perception thing, is I think. You stay in your sense perception. If you do that by looking or by feeling your breath, that seems to me just different styles. What is the same is that you keep in flow, and it's like keeping in flow, because the kind of the borders, they are made, is what keeps you in is this, the sense perception, looking, hearing, because there's all these different styles of meditation. Sensing in some way keeps one in flow, because otherwise minds have the tendency to get stuck in an I whirlpool at one or the other side of the flow. And so the sense perception is a very good way of keeping that from happening, and then waiting it out till that creativity moment comes almost. That's my picture of it.
that's interesting. I'm just reading, nearly finished this book called The Strange Nature of Things. I think that's what it's called. And it's, the premise of the book is that senses, feelings, are the underpinnings of all of human nature, up and including culture, human cultures. And we've just been got a 10-minute warning, John, just to let you know, which I forgot to mention last time. And there's this, it's quite interesting in that he talks about homeostasis as the life force, and it is that is the driver for everything. And it is quite interesting, and it does put a different slant on the way that feelings react with thought processes and consciousness and the development of self and everything else. So when you were talking, Elfie, about the senses being the focus, that seems to attune very much with what this book was saying. I'll find it out and post it up. But it's quite a different. It's a hypothesis I haven't come across before. It's a different way of a different approach to trying to explain the nature of where we are now, in that it's based far more on feeling than on reasoning.
Well, I remember that book that I talked about a while ago. I've actually just re-listened to it because I did a podcast for my company, and that the reasoning is for argumentation, is for justification, is not for making up your mind. It does not make the decisions. That is all done in the sensing, feeling world. And thank God that, because often that's how it's organized, what I see in myself and others. And that's not a bad thing, because it's damn intelligent, and makes incredibly good decisions most of the time. And then sometimes it gets overwhelmed. But reasoning is there for communicating what has been decided. And communicating and finding best solutions amongst each other, not alone in your little room, not the Cartesian way, but with others in communion. I love that idea. And I think that is, yeah, that's much more what I observe as well, what's happening inside me. Hey, you know what? I read that there's a philosopher. She's a woman. That's about the only thing I can say at the moment. She said, the difference between secular and religious is completely insignificant if you compare it to the decision to get out of bed in the morning and approach life or contemplating suicide. What do you think? So the big thing is saying yes to life, I guess, not if you do that in a religious or secular way. I'm just throwing that in. Will you give it another go today? That shut everyone up.
Wow.
I find a quote. I thought in a time like this, with all its so not confronted, exposed to such magnitude of stuff coming my way, I thought that was somewhat. It was a nice thought. Yeah. Hey, can we do it another way? Hey.
But is that helpful?
I think it helped me in that moment, which is why I probably remember as little as I do, because it appreciated the effort and willingness and capacity of doing another day of multitudes of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, it sort of depends on what you mean by religion, and secular is just a word, just means everything, and I don't I don't sort of see it as a boxy thing, but religion can be, and I don't, I have no problem with people that are religious. It's dogma that's the problem, and it's the religious hierarchies that are the problem. And
true,
I don't, if you can believe it, people can believe whatever they like, and and that's lovely. It's fine. It's wonderful. It's only when you think, if you don't believe what I believe, there's something wrong with you, and I'm going to chop your head off. And it's when, and I'm not even sure whether the word religious is what's relevant about that. It's this dogmatic belief that I am correct and you are wrong, and that you're, by not accepting my beliefs, I'm going to have to do something to change your mind. And that's, that to me is where the problems lie, not within but it's all this problem with words. It's so the word secular and the word religious can mean all sorts of different things.
Thank you. That realigned me.
Well, anyway, less than a minute to go. So it's been lovely as always. Amazing to see you and chat and